Hi class, it's Bill Berry with the second video in our function series. In the first video we talked about the lazy professor analogy to get us all on the same page and kind of understand some basic things about functions and how we need to have clear descriptions and quote contracts for each thing that comes into and out of the function. So we've established the analogy, but we need to now move into something a little more concrete, and that is how do functions actually work in JavaScript. And by the way, it works very similarly in other languages, so don't be surprised. You'll use them in other places. They won't look that different than this. So let's jump back to where we were and let's continue on writing and using our own functions. So the two things that we're going to do here is we're going to learn to define a function, right? You have to say what the function is and what it does, and then you have to call it to do its work. Now again, we did something similar to this. We actually used this when we wrote form validation and form display functions, right? We defined the function in one spot and then we called it using the onClick method in a button, let's say, in the form. But here we're not tying ourselves into a form, we're just using sort of functions separately. So we're going to learn to define a function and to call a function. And we're also going to see that we can use them as basic building blocks, so we can actually use a function within another function, right? So we can create larger and larger units, right? Larger building blocks that do more stuff. So let's look at the simple definition of a function, how it works, and then how we call it. And then we'll start moving closer, and we'll actually start writing some code soon. All right, so how do you define the function? If you want to define it, you first use the word function. Now this has to go in a script block, right? You can't write this in HTML. Functions are part of JavaScript, not part of HTML. So you've got to be in a script block to do this. You're going to say the word function, all lowercase, then you're going to put a space, then you're going to put a valid identifier. Naming of a function works just like naming of a variable. We tend to name these things with verbs, by the way, because functions do things for us. So we tend to start with a verb to describe what action is carried out by the function. So foo is just a placeholder to get us started. After that, you always put parentheses, right? In fact, just like we write other things, if statements or while loops and things like that, we should get in the habit of putting the word function, putting the name of our function, and then immediately typing open, close parentheses, space, open curly brace, and then hit enter a couple times and put the closing curly brace down here, right? And then any code that you want to have as part of the function goes between the open and close curly braces, of course, right? Because those designate a block. So we want the function to be associated with all of that code. Another way to think about it, it says, look, when you tap me on the shoulder, right? Me being foo in this case, whatever I've called this function. When you tap me on the shoulder, I'm going to do all the things you ask me to do because they're all listed here, right? Now, when you define a function, it does not at that moment run the code, right? It makes it possible for you to run the code, but it does not instantly jump into action and run it. In fact, it just waits, right? It's sort of, that's the setup, and it waits for you to call it in order to start acting. The calling of the function is just using the name foo, right? Whatever you called this function here, you're going to call it here. And all you have to do is use the name. You put the name of the function, and then always with the function, open and close curly braces. Now, I'm sorry, open and close parentheses. Now, in the future, we're going to put some stuff in the parentheses, but that's immaterial for now. We're just getting the basics, right? So defining a function, function space, name of the function, open parentheses, curly braces, write some code. When you want to call the function, you use the name of the function, right? So this is just like in our lazy professor analogy. When the professor wants his snacks, he can just say, get snacks, or tap whoever's in charge, Susie in our case, on the shoulder, and she goes and runs and does that task. So in this case, we can define the function, we can call the function, right? So that's the simple thing that we need to know about making them work. Now, one little side comment, and that is where we tend to write these, right? So let me just jump over. I'll say this stuff while I'm working, and then you can come back and read it on the slide. I'll pause it when we get back. One of the things that you're going to see in normal HTML pages is that the body section gets very, very busy. It's usually busy showing the user text, working with images, all sorts of interesting stuff. So the body is often quite busy. So what we often do is I'm going to just copy this body section and I'm going to paste it up here, and I'm going to make a head section up here. right? So I'm going to make this the head section and sort of open and close head. Notice I'm leaving a script section here and a script section here. I don't need this line. That's good. And so what we tend to do is we often write our functions up here, and then we put our quote main code, the code that drives those functions and kind of manages the whole process. Often we put that in the body. That could be in response to something like a form, or it just could just sit there, right? The code can just sit there and it'll automatically be run as part of the body HTML. So very often we do that. We put the function definitions here and the calling of it or the management of it in the body section, right? So that's what I'm going to do in my examples. So let me go back to the slide, and then you can pause it if you want to read the whole thing. All right, so let's now start writing a function and see how to use it. Let's say that we're writing some sort of payroll program. So I'm just going to put a comment that says payroll stuff is managed here. Right? So we're going to write some little payroll script. And as part of that payroll script, we find that very often we want to draw kind of a vertical, or sorry, a horizontal line across the screen. We want to have a pretty little line to kind of be a border between things. But we find that we're doing that a lot. And so we could just keep copying and pasting the code for that, but that's really not a desirable thing. Let me just show you. If we do document.write and I take this and I do this, right? This is a kind of cheesy way to do this, but you get the idea. And since we want that on its own line, I can also put a break tag in that, right? So it's on its own line. Well, that's great. But you say, that's not that big a deal. Why don't I just copy and paste that? Well, what if I decide later that I want to put fewer or more dashes here? Then I have to go back and change every single one of them, right? So we really don't want to do that. Even for simple code like this, it's really kind of a pain to have to go back and fix it. And we should get this sort of spidey sense as we get better at programming that says, anytime you duplicate code, you really want to see if you can find a way around that, right? Duplicated code is not our friend, and it's going to lead to bugs. We're going to forget things later because of it. So I'm going to take this out. What can we do to solve that problem? Well, what if I put that in a function, and so anytime I wanted to, I could just call that function. How would that work? Well, I can come up to my head section, and I can write a function called, again, verb-oriented tend to be, display line, or display separator, or whatever we want to do. So notice function space name of function. Notice it's color coded by Notepad++, so we know it's not a keyword, right? If I had typed document or something, we would get a different color perhaps, or not document, but another keyword like for, right? It would be a different color. So notice immediately I'm going to do this, right? I'm going to type the two parentheses, and I'm going to put an open curly brace, and I'm going to move down a couple lines so I'm ready to go. So get in that habit. Function space, write the name of it, put two parentheses, put an open curly brace, and leave some space for you to type, and you know you're going to indent here. Now, what can I do in here, right? I want to display the line. Well, I'm just going to take this line. In fact, I'm going to cut it from here, and I'm going to go paste it here. This says I'm creating a function called display line. When I call that function, I want it to do everything between the curly braces. In this case, I just want you to write out this separator line, right? That's all you have to do to make a simple function. Now, down here, if I want to make that thing work, I want to make it go, what do I have to do? I just have to type the name of the function. Notice that that's now in my autocomplete. It's in the vocabulary that Notepad knows about, so I don't have to retype it. I can choose it by pressing Tab. And then don't forget the parentheses. Just about every time, for our purposes, every time that you call a function, you want to put the parentheses. They just go with a function call or a function definition. You always have parentheses, right? So just get used to that. Now that's great. Let's go see if it works. Save, run, launch in Firefox. Boom, there's our line. Great. Now, how can I use that? Well, maybe I'm going to write a little welcome message that says document.write. Something like this. Welcome to the payroll program. Right, so I create that, I save it, I could run it, that's fine. And I think, ooh, you know what? It would be kind of pretty to have that line, that little dashed line after it. So I'm going to go ahead and put a break tag here because I want that on its own line. And then maybe I want to do display line again. Right? don't forget the parentheses. So in this case, display line is going to be called. That will send control up here. It will freeze this program for a minute. Display line's code will be run. It will display the line. Control will come back here. Then the document.write will happen. It'll write the text. Then it'll call display line. This will pause. It'll come up to the function, run all of its code. When that's finished, it comes back. It's finished. No more to the script. We're done. So you get the mental picture of exactly the call and coming back kind of idea. Now let's save that and let's run it and see what it looks like. Ooh, cool. Maybe more lines, right? Maybe we need more lines. Well, lucky for us, adding more lines doesn't cost us anything because all I have to do is change it one place now, and now I'm done, all right? I can just go run it again. Perfect, all right? So it looks great. All right, so that's the easy way to write a simple function and call the function. So pause that if you want to and really absorb what's happening here. If you don't call it, right, let's say you don't do these things, right, if I don't have these lines that call display line, the function is never going to get called. It's defined, but it's not used, so the code never runs. So you have to put the lines to call the function wherever it is that you need its work to be done. Now, just to take it one step further, I'm going to pause here, let you pause it if you want to look at it again before I start modifying it. So go ahead and do that. The next step that we're going to look at is it's not completely, it is possible to use building blocks using functions that already exist to make other functions. The thing that I want to show you here is maybe you want to make this its own function, right? So that when you call it, you get all of these lines run. So I could come up here and I could make another function called function, oops, how about spell it right? Function display header. And when I do display header, what I want it to do is all of this stuff. So watch what I can do. Copy, cut out that code rather, paste it here, highlight it all, tab it over, right? Now, what do I have? I have a function called display header. When I call display header, it's going to call display line, right? And then, of course, down here, I better call that if I want it to work. Display header, paren, don't forget, right? So watch what happens here and think about how your code is actually executing, right? I call display header. It jumps up here. Display line is called, so it jumps up here. It writes out all the things, writes the break, returns to here. This is done. It writes out welcome to payroll program. It calls display line, so this is paused, comes up here, writes out all these, writes the break, comes back here. No more lines in the function. That's done. Control comes back here. There's no more lines in the script, so we're done. So I've now use the building block of one function to build another function, right? Which is super useful, and it follows exactly the patterns that we've already talked about. So I save that, I go to run it, and it'll work just the same as before, right? Everything's cool. All right. Now, if you mistype one of these, you can get some interesting stuff, right? So let me just make a mistake here. Put an extra character in the name of it, and let's just see what happens, right? What is the error that I get, right? Nothing happens. Well, look at your console, F12. Reference error, display header X is not defined. Well, sure enough, we tried to call a function that doesn't exist, so therefore it's not defined, therefore it won't work. So watch those kinds of errors. Make sure that you're copying and pasting or using autocomplete to do that correctly. The other thing I want to point out to you here is the order of these doesn't matter for JavaScript's sake. I could put the display header function before the display line function, and it's going to work just the same. I'll prove it to you. So you don't have to define this function before you use this function in another function. It seems odd, but what JavaScript will do is sort of gobble up all of the functions and try to sort of figure out what's what, and you don't have to be precious or careful about the order in which you create these functions. That's kind of nice. Now, I would put them in a logical order, right? If you get a really long program with lots of functions, you might put them alphabetically so they're easier to find, or you might put them in order of the call hierarchy so that it's kind of clear, the things would be there in a logical spot. But it doesn't matter in terms of JavaScript. It'll take into account that, and it'll sort of make it work. So let's jump back to the slide. Let me let you pause here. So I'll just let you pause and take this in if you want. All right, so let's jump back to our slides. So we talked about where we'd write functions. We wrote this function example. You know now where they go. And then we did a second example. We used the definition and call, of course, in both cases. Then we wrote another example where we created another building block, another function, which counted on and used a function that we wrote again in somewhere else in JavaScript, right? So it called display line from this function, and everything worked exactly as we needed it to work. So functions as building blocks, right? Super useful stuff. Again, we're sort of starting with baby steps, right? We're just learning to use the very basic idea of calling and making sure that our brains are really in tune with what happens when you call and when you return. Okay. Now, going on, I just talked about that, so you've got that. Now, the next thing that we're going to do, if you're with me in class, is that we're going to take on a challenge, right? We're going to use functions in some interesting ways, and we're going to build on them. We're going to build functions up from other functions and really do some neat stuff with that to solidify this knowledge, because again, this is super example and a little bit confusing to people when they first start. So we're going to spend a lot of time working on functions. So this is one of the challenges that we will undertake, and I will sort of leave that for those who are going to be in class to work on together. Otherwise, feel free to have some fun and work on it if you'd like. The next thing is some resources. I do have a link to resources, and in this case it's not going to be one that's interesting because I had another video that sort of covered some of this stuff for another class, so that's not useful to you. You don't care because you've already watched this video. But thanks for watching, and next week we'll pick up with another series on functions where we're learning a little more about how to fulfill those contracts that we talked about with information coming in and information going out. Kind of important stuff, so we're going to let this settle for a little bit, and then we'll move on and work on that. So thanks for watching this video, and hope to see you in the next series.